everybody, and welcome to the All Things Social Impact podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Kanaris, and we're joined today by the wonderful Carla Martinez. Carla, thank you for joining us here today. For the audience and those watching and those listening, would you like to introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your story?
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks again for the invitation. I think it's wonderful that, these spaces are available today for people
Thank
to,
you.
get to know who else is in the same
Yes.
boat.
Mm.
Yeah, well, my name is Carla. I originally come from Chile, but I've been now living in Australia for 5 years, but I've been back and forwards at least for gosh, I think at least for like 12 or between 12 and 15 years back and forward between Chile and Australia. And my background initially is in public policy. But after that, I have been doing a lot of training in community and stakeholder engagement, social impact assessment. I also have a master's degree in development practice, major in planning for social development at the University of Queensland. And yeah, and also have done some studying on environmental impact management.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So, just to frame the whole conversation, because everyone has a different, seems to have nuances around how they define social impact. So, when we're talking about social impact to you, it'd be really useful if everyone knows how you define social impact,
Yeah,
what
so
it means
for
to you.
me, social impact refers to the change that people experiences, and that change might come from programs, projects like developments, mining, energy, but also can come from policies. So it's change that people experiences, and this change can be either positive or negative, and also it can be intended or unintended.
Yes.
And for me that's why it's important to understand social impacts and the change that might be brought about projects, yeah, because it allows you to identify whether the objectives that you have in your policy are they going to be made achieved or not, or also is a renewable energy project or a mining project or a road project, is it going to have another unintended consequences for people.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think for a lot of people listening who've worked specifically in social impact assessment for the approvals process, that definition will certainly resonate with them. If you are talking about, I guess let's talk about what attracted you to want to work in social impact. How did social impact assessment become something that you were attracted to and that you pursued as a career?
Yeah, so it's funny because when I grew up in Chile, and since I was in school, I started to pay more and more attention to social movements. We have a very strong social movement from people who is in school and universities. And, I started to observe why there was so much conflict, why people is always out in the streets, what's happening. And I think it initially started from a policy perspective, but then also we had in Chile some very controversial mining developments that gain national and international attention. And I also started to become very interested in those type of developments and how government approvals or rejection of a project can also impact people. So but it wasn't until I came to Australia to do my master's degree that I came across to the social impact assessment as a discipline
Yes.
and as
Yeah.
a practice and the methodologies. And because I think in Chile our environmental management system is still quite new. It was only rolled out in the early 2000s.
Right.
Also, by the time I was finishing university, there wasn't really any guidelines. So it wasn't until I came to Australia that I came across social impact assessment as a discipline, and also the difference between in terms of methodology of social impact assessment, but also policy and program evaluation.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's I guess how I came across to social impact as a discipline, and after that I've been able to apply those methodologies throughout my career, yeah, in the last 10 years.
Wonderful. So that's a great segue, and I think we did the same course at UQ actually. So there you go. I was wondering then if we can skip into your career there, into your
Mhm.
professional career around social impact, and what that looked like. What has your journey been? What's your story around social impact, and how have you applied those skills in the
Yeah.
work that you do? And I guess what are the challenges that you've come across early in your career,
Yeah.
both from a career perspective, but also from a technical practitioner perspective that you've had to
Yeah.
overcome?
Yeah, well, my career has been very diverse, and I think I've been fortunate to experience working from government to NGOs, private sector, and now in consulting. So I think that, yeah, having that previous experience has really supported me in my practice, and especially now that, I have a role where I'm not directly involved in the delivery of projects. Like I'm not part of the developers team anymore.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really it's been really interesting to apply wearing different hats in all my I guess my knowledge and experience in social impact assessment. But where I have had the most opportunity to apply social impact assessment and management tool, it was when I worked in Chile for a mining company for about 5 years. So I led the community and stakeholder engagement team for the mining company. And as part of my responsibilities, it was not just liaising with the community, but also making sure that social impacts and environmental impacts on the community were early identified, avoided where possible, and managed appropriately, as well as working with the communities towards leaving a positive legacy. So it was basically, yes, spanning for managing social change, but both positive and negatively. And I guess and then moving into consultancy, which has been in the last 5 years now. Yeah, so I think each one of those roles has different challenges, but now thinking on my latest role as a consultant, to me, and thinking as well, reflecting back to the opportunities and possibilities I had when I was working directly for the developer, is that I see that social impact assessment often comes very late in the process. And I think that can be very frustrating for us, as consultants, people who, is trying to push for better practice. And yeah, but by the time that we're doing a social impact assessment for a planning and approval
Yes.
stage, which I think is quite dominant still, like the use of social impact assessment,
Yeah.
mostly focused for planning approvals. It just arrives very late in the process. There is very little wiggle room to influence on a project, on its design. So even, trying to apply the hierarchy of avoidance, it's just really, really hard. So
Yeah.
that's something that I've been very fortunate in some of the work that I have delivered lately in the last year and a half, is that we have been working with developers to embed social impact as a process in the early stages of the delivery of the design of their project. So
It's
when they're
fantastic.
going early on to, determine where could this project be located. Okay, let's start thinking about the social impacts that intervention could have on communities. Let's do some targeted engagement. So it has meant that the people within the organization, the engineers and the social practitioners, are coming together early on, way earlier before the social
Yes.
impact assessment is required for planning approvals, to start thinking about the social impacts and how they could be mitigated and avoided. So I think that's been something rewarding about how to address the challenge that I'm faced as a consultant when we get engaged for doing SIAs for planning approvals. We want to avoid doing the ticking of the box
Yeah.
exercise.
I don't know if you know this, but your face lit up when you know how excited you were about the fact that you're able to actually influence something from the design. So let's, because I think for people listening, particularly young, I mean, even experienced ones who are still struggling with this, because I think it's an ongoing struggle, but particularly for early career listeners and people viewing this, what kind of impact does that have? Let's play on the word impact, but what kind of effect does that have? Sort of unpack a little bit, like what is it too? Because you're talking about design, right? Is that the
Yeah.
primary thing that you're talking about?
Yeah,
And then how does that actually shift a project? And how did you go about doing that with the client? Just that maybe people out there might have some frames of reference to go, maybe I could try having this conversation with clients to help them along this journey.
yeah, so basically what we have done is supported clients in looking at their practices, like their procedures, and identifying opportunities to embed those social impact considerations. So, and that requires a commitment from the organization
Yeah.
and I guess a self-identification of we could be doing things differently and
Mm,
better, and sometimes it will, I think, as people, we all learn from mistakes, and it will take to some organizations to be in a bad spot, I guess, to have a community that is, I mean, to have a project that it has resulted in angst from community, or a
yeah.
project that maybe they were not able to develop or gain approval because there was no engagement, the social
Mm,
impacts, the distribution of impacts and benefits was unbalanced. So, yeah, sometimes it takes that organizational learning and the willingness to change in order for them to take the next step and say, okay, how can we, do things better? But also, I think that there is a lot of clients and organizations that understand that the social context has changed, and that
yes.
the approaches that we were using 10, 15 years ago, they're no longer suitable to this new environment where there is so much going on. And if we think about the renewable energy transition, not so many co-located renewable energy projects, that obviously that requires different approaches to how you engage with community when you are designing your project. Where you're going to locate it, it brings a lot of more complexity, and that requires developers to be aware and identify early on those complexities. So yeah, I think that is very much leveraging from the experience of developers on this field and their own
Yeah.
learnings, but also bringing on learnings from what has happened elsewhere, and acknowledging that the context has changed and we need to
Yeah.
adapt. And I think that, in the practice, it will mean moving the project slightly to, it could be within the same locality, but maybe it's moved a couple of kilometers to avoid a place of significance to the community.
Yeah.
It might mean in the practice as well, if there are concerns about visual impacts, working with the community about how we could address those visual impacts and things like that. So yeah, it's really about thinking early on about what are the social constraints and opportunities that could improve the design of the project.
That's great. And I think you're right. The context is definitely changing, and social impact's definitely a lot more on the radar,
Yeah.
not just in Australia, but globally, in terms of even the developers sort of being more aware that they
Yeah.
have to approach things a bit differently. And some have been caught on the back foot with it because it's been moving so quickly. So
Yeah.
your role, just if we can stick with this example, because I think it's a wonderful example to use from a role, from your social practitioner role, if you're the social impact practitioner or social practitioner, whether you're in the organization or whether you're there as a consultant, once you're aware that there's a problem, that your organization is open to a new way forward, how did you start that conversation? What would your advice be to someone around how to start that conversation What did you do to prepare for that conversation, and how did you broach that issue with the client?
Yeah, I think for me it's really important to understand the ways that all the stakeholders and see the issue and what the motivations are. So in the case of the client, I like to understand first what have they done, you know,
Yeah.
how did the project commence, what was the engagement, was there an engagement or not, how their processes for making decisions work, who is involved in the side of the client. So first is kind of understanding where they're coming from, and then from the project itself and in the communities, getting that understanding of, okay, what are the key characteristics of this community, what they have gone through, have they gone through any, you know, environmental changes, natural disasters that might make this community more vulnerable to change?
Yes.
Have these communities experienced a lot of development in the past? Are they going to experience a lot of development in the future? What are their key concerns? So it's getting an understanding of both parties, but also getting on the table, okay, what is happening in terms of our legislative requirements? What are we seeing that is changing? And I think the combination of those three elements
Yes.
help develop a business case about, it would be great to do this because of these are the conditions of the community, these are the requirements, this is what is changing, this is what is coming. It will be way more like it will put you in the best foot forward
Yes.
if you adopt some of these initiatives
Mm.
to get the project ahead and minimize impacts on the community. So yeah, I think it comes by understanding where the client, the developers come from, what all the efforts they have done or not done, understanding the community, but also understanding the broader policy context and where it's heading towards.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was beautiful. Thank you, because you really laid out a nice kind of way. A lot of it is about doing your homework for yourself, but for them. My experience has been that whether it's been using these skills in like policy for you, because like you, I had a past life in policy and the government realm and strategy, and it is about, I found the best results was when I did my homework for me, yes, of course, but also took it on to not expect them to understand the why they need to do it and the how they do it, because it's not their area of expertise. So in a lot of instances, we're talking about engineers and their job is to design and to solve problems. They don't necessarily have a full understanding of what it is that we do. So it's the recognition that if I give the answers to them and the why and have laid it out logically and for them, that it's better results. Did you find that it was well received in the fact that you had been so well prepared and when you went into these meetings?
Yeah, well, I think it has played in different ways. So
Yeah,
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 I'll be in situations where it's been well received, and there is that trust that
yeah.
yes, let's go for it. But there has been cases where I have brought benchmarks internationally showing all this evidence and still nothing
Still,
happens. And as a consultant now, I'm just learning to deal with that, like just to keep going. Because yeah,
yeah,
I think that as consultants, our opportunities to influence those decisions as well are more limited, as if I think about when I used to work for that mining company in Chile.
yeah.
I had I had more exposure to the decision makers within the organization. I had way more time to have those conversations with them. And but in this role as a consultant, we have set time frames, limited exposures to those decision makers. But yeah, I think it's making the most of those opportunities and bringing
Yeah.
on that evidence. But also something that I've seen that works for me is also to co-design some of the solutions with them. Because yeah, I
Yes.
think, and I found that engineers, and you mentioned as well, they're very solutions oriented.
Yes.
So co-designing those responses with them also is very helpful.
Yeah, I actually think co-design is a wonderful thing. And that can come in small ways as well as large ways. Like I find, when you're doing your social impact management and building your metrics, like including the client rather than sitting there and going, I'm the social impact practitioner, I'm gonna come up with a whole heap of management plans and
Yeah.
and metrics. Sometimes it's really useful to really bring them in and kind of co-design them with them and sort of have some suggestions, but not so tightened up that they're not sort of involved in that process and sort of helping build those metrics
Exactly.
together. I mean, so you can do it in small ways, can't you? It doesn't have to be, designing the whole project, although that's wonderful when it happens. But sometimes, like you say, as a consultant, that's not always something you have access to. So you've got to look for the opportunities to use that co-design in the small places because that'll build trust like over time. They'll trust you. But you pointed out something else that I thought was really important for listeners, especially I think the people who experience the frustration of being the consultant who is in and out and isn't having that longevity of being able to build their relationship with their client over like with their employer over time, access to the decision makers as you make. But even then, that takes time and patience. But I think particularly as consultants, which a lot of social practitioners find themselves in this space increasingly, and historically, I think a lot of practitioners I know are working in some kind of consultancy role. And I think one of the things that you pointed out was resilience. It's about being resilient, being persistent, but it's also about understanding the limitations of what you're doing. So manage your own expectations. So what was your advice to be, having done this for such a long time now? How would you say to somebody who's listening, who's feeling frustrated, are there any tools that you use to help yourself sort of manage your own expectations? What kind of tools do you use? How do you get through those frustrating times where you just sort of go, this could
Yeah,
have
I
been such
think,
a great project,
yeah,
and yet,
I
the client's not
think
listening or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I think it's very important to surround yourself with people in the profession. And that's why I think it's great that you're working on and putting forward this podcast. Yeah, I think what has been the most useful for me is being having mentors and creating relationships with people in the field, in the practice, social impact practitioners, with whom I can, pick up the phone, have a conversation, share either my frustrations or any challenges that I'm facing, and have a conversation and seek some, feedback or guidance. I think that has been really, really useful for me. And even with my team as well, we will debrief about, okay, what went well, what didn't go so well, what can we do differently. But something as well is very that, I will advise any young professional that is, developing an social impact assessment, working in a project, is
Yeah.
always to listen to your gut feeling. If something is making you uncomfortable, if something just doesn't feel right for you, reach out, because it's likely that something is not quite right. And
Yes.
sometimes it's just hard, to identify and pin it down. So having that conversation with somebody with more experience or that has been in that position before, is just really important to help you go through those challenging times, I guess.
I think that's really good advice. I think you're right. It's too easy to dismiss the gut feeling. I think particularly when you're in your early career, like you said, it's the confidence may not quite be there yet, or even the experience might quite, your breadth of experience might quite not be there for you to understand why you're feeling uneasy, or it might just not be that obvious on the surface of things. That's great because you've got a team, but there is, as you know, there's a lot of places that you will work as a social practitioner where you're sitting there by yourself. There is nobody else. You're surrounded by either environmental expertise,
Yeah,
and they might have a limited understanding of what you do, or you're working with engineers
yeah,
who are a completely different skill set, and they're complementary, and you need to work with them. But there are times where you are sitting there, you're the only one, you don't have a team per se, and if you do, it's so small that you risk the echo chamber. And you said you need that support network. So here's the really important thing: where did you find your support network? Because you've obviously had times where you didn't have a team per se, you may have been one or two people. So in those instances, where is your people, where are they, and how did you find them?
Yeah, so well, when I did my studies at the University of Queensland, I came across some wonderful people, professors, and people that was just introduced to me with a lot of years of practice. And I just have really held into those connections, and they've been great. They have transformed into friendships and mentorship relationships.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's about, not being afraid of reaching out to people that even if they don't work with me, they can provide that support and guidance. But also something that I did in Chile is that I attending conferences and training. And even I remember I enrolled in a diploma in Chile, and when I was enrolling, they asked me, why are you doing this diploma? You are already in a leadership position. Why? And you already have a master degree. Why are you doing this diploma? And I was,
Yeah.
because I want to get other people that is in the same boat with me. And I found that, attending conferences, becoming part of a professional bodies like the International Association for Impact Assessment, the
Yeah.
environmental impact of Australia and New Zealand. They have been great organizations for me to build that network outside of work, and to get to know other professionals in the industry in the same boat as
Yes.
me. So yes, that's been one of the tools when I've been, the only social scientist, the only social practitioner in the room. That's where I got my support from.
Yeah, and I think we can't underestimate that that's likely to happen at some point on your social impact journey. That you will find yourself in positions where you have to look outside. So they're really great examples. There are a lot of professional organisations, your workshopping opportunities, courses, going back to people that you went to university with and finding where they're working, and if you had a relationship with them, like keeping that relationship alive
Yeah.
is important. And I know that you get busy. I don't know if you find this also, but I think a lot of people might find I get really busy and I haven't spoken to people for a long time. They're also busy. They will understand, like reach out when you can. I think it's important to let people know that just because people are busy doesn't mean they're not going to appreciate that connection when you reach out as well. So I think that's really important. If you were to say to someone, what are the biggest sort of example of something going wrong in social impact, whether it be the project or just the process is not going well, what was it and how did you overcome it?
Well, I think that what I was describing earlier about, when the SIA is just too late in the process, and
Yeah.
there is no wiggle room to do any changes. Obviously, the follow-on effect is that you use the, angst and opposition to a project just keeps building and building until, somebody will finally make a decision to make things differently.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it really comes down to that. Yes, it's that realization that today we do need to do things a little bit differently.
Yeah. So if you're in a situation, and obviously you've been in one where you're having to do a social impact assessment, it's late in the day, there's opposition to the project. It's clear that there's not going to be objections. I think we've all been in that position where you can sort of see it coming down the line. That there's going to be lots of objections, and this isn't going to be a straightforward, process. What can you do as a social practitioner that, regardless of the fact that it's a difficult one, that it is late in the day, that the client probably didn't, maybe even not from some fault of their own, just the fact that they didn't have a full understanding early on, didn't do the work, has found themselves in a position where not going well? What can you do as a social practitioner to make that social impact assessment as robust and as effective as it can be.
Yeah,
You know,
I think that is very much about, acknowledging the impacts, and if I wasn't able to influence on effective mitigations, it's really acknowledging your high residual impacts and your limitations. And I see that as a way that we will never say to a community there is no social impacts, there is no change, when they are very much feeling it and
yeah,
worry about it. I think that, for me as a practitioner, even though if I was not able to influence on the outcomes of a project or the mitigations that probably I thought that were right, but the developer thought that they were not feasible to
yeah,
implement, I think that it's very important to acknowledge that on the assessment, and that, there were impacts that they were just not mitigated. And I think that acknowledgement is important for communities
yeah,
as well. And that might help in some cases to bring that tension down. So it's really about, in those cases, demonstrating with the assessment that effectively there will be social impacts, and whether, it will be the decision of
somebody
the
else.
approvals
Yeah,
department to decide whether the benefits of the project
yeah,
kind of balance out some of those social impacts, and whether they could put more conditions of approvals to the development of the project. But yeah, I think that if those are not acknowledged, it's almost like becoming
yeah,
accomplice and part of that.
yeah. I think it's really, I think what you've touched on there is really important. If you're conducting a social impact assessment in an approvals process in Australia, and just about anywhere really in the approvals process, you're actually an independent expert putting a report. So whilst the client might be paying for it, the intent is that you're supposed to be independent. So you're supposed to be
Yeah,
giving your professional opinion based on all the data collected, the information and data that you've collected. And I think it's really important to stay true to that, which is pretty much
yeah,
what you're saying. If you see an impact, call it out. Make sure that it's in the report. Make sure that the evidence and the data that supports that assessment is clearly articulated in the report, even if the mitigations that you recommended are not taken up by the client.
yeah,
Because somewhere down the process, there may be a chance for the client or somebody further down the line who is part of the decision making or the review process may have an influence that is outside of your realm, if that makes sense. Am
yeah,
I
yeah.
reflecting back kind of what you were
Yeah, and,
saying?
and I
Because
think,
I think
so
it's
some
really
of our
important.
colleagues, and in some of these professional organizations, there has been a lot of conversations around, the different influences that as
Yeah,
practitioners we are subject to during our development of professional of SIAs, and yeah, and how to that independence, how to remain that independence. And I think that comes back to what I mentioned before, is following your gut feeling, reaching out to people that
yeah,
and can give you advice. Obviously, when we're engaged for a specific project, we cannot share, the details of, like, the
correct.
name and all the details of
There'll be
that specific project.
confidentiality.
Yeah, but we can always, get some guidance and advance, and even talking through with your environmental team and with other people in the business, it can be very helpful as well.
Yeah,
Something that also helps, besides being part of these, like the networking of these organizations, is their code of conducts as well, and the principles. So by becoming a member of a specific organizations, or becoming certified by some of those organizations, basically is our commitment as practitioners to obey by those principles. and
yes,
and that helps as well, to stand a little bit differently when you're having those conversations with a
100%.
client or with a colleague that is trying to
Yes,
influence the outcomes of a report.
yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that's right. And I think the other tool that is available apart from your, ethical ones as a professional is also the guidelines that are available. So, for
Yeah,
example, New South Wales, Queensland's got legislation.
yeah,
Lean on those.
absolutely.
Like know them inside out, know what the requirements are and the expectations are, and don't be afraid to use those when you're having a conversation. And I think if you're not feeling confident, if you're kind of a bit more early career, your advice of going, well, take that and go, how do I have this conversation? Because the confidence comes with time, and the practice of having those conversations gets easier the more you do it. So if you're in your early career, it's first time, I think your advice around reach out to somebody who's done it before and let them help you craft that response, and or maybe help you sort of understand what you'll need in order to have a really constructive conversation, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's really great advice. So if we can then flip it. You gave an example earlier, but I'm going to ask you: is that your favorite? Is that the thing, the experience that kind of made you really extremely excited about social impact? That has been your kind of shining light in terms of a project or a piece of work that you've been particularly like to share in terms of your
Yes, so,
experience? Is
so
it
for
positive?
me, and I gave some hints earlier when I was talking about, yeah, the opportunity to influence, and how when you're wearing different hats and at different organizations, you get different opportunities to influence. When I was working in Chile for 5 years at this mining site in the Atacama Desert, it was transformational. The experience, the relationship that I was able to build with the communities and also internally with the organization, it resulted in a lot of positive change. So from managing the social impacts of this mining operation that has been in place, operating for over 20 years,
Hmm.
getting the community involved in environmental management practices, cultural heritage, which is something that is not set as a requirement.
Yeah.
And also, acknowledging that when you have an operation that is already in place, has already gone through the planning approvals, they have already assessed impacts. So inviting to do things differently and add additional controls to something
Yes.
that is meeting the regulators' expectations and requirements. It was a process that, it wasn't from one day to another, but we were able to establish as a team some long-term practices. So yeah, that work, I'm very proud of how we manage and, change the way that we were managing the social environmental impacts of the mine with the community. But also that's the place where I was given with the opportunity to design my dream methodology for social impact assessment
Oh,
and
wow.
environmental impact assessment.
Yeah.
So I was trusted by the organization with leading an SIA and an environmental impact assessment study under the International Finance Corporation performance standard, which, it goes
Yes.
well and beyond the regulatory requirements in Chile. And basically, we were able to, put funding to address some of those power imbalances between a mining operation and indigenous communities. We basically put resources up front for the community to appoint their own advisors, environmental, social,
Yeah.
legal advisors, to
Yeah.
review with them the SIA. We also put funding forward to have community monitors that develop together with the technical specialists, the flora and fauna baseline, cultural heritage, and social impact assessment studies. And we did that as well by setting up agreements with how we were going to roll out the
Yeah.
process. So I have not come across to that methodology in my 5 years in Australia, and I would love to do it again. That's to me that was a dream. That was a
That is a
dream.
dream.
Yeah.
And I think you put on something like it's whilst there's a lot of frustrations in this space because there's a theory of how you do things, there's an ideal, if you like, and then there's the reality that it doesn't always play out that way. But every now and again, you will get a client who will allow you to implement the gold standard,
Yeah.
practice. And when it does happen, it's amazing. Like that process that you outlined is stunningly, that you were able to achieve that. But you said a key word in there, and it was trust.
Yeah.
You know, the client trusted you.
Mm.
The people you were working with trusted you to do that. And as social practitioners, I think that has to always be at the forefront of our minds is, building trust will always aid and support our ability to do really good work. We've got a better chance of getting great outcomes if we can build trust. So
Yeah, absolutely.
your relationships with your client, it's not just with communities and it's not just with your workers and with your fellow social practitioners. That energy of building trust with your clients is really critical for the
Absolutely.
actual outcomes, because they're the ones who give you the ability to do that wonderful work that you did with that job. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
So if you had to give, say, a piece of advice to an early career person that's listening at the moment, if you could give them just two things that they need to do in helping develop their career in social impact, what would it be?
Reach out, reach out to you, reach out to me, reach out to other people in the practice, network, become part of, well, sometimes you don't need to be part of the organization, but just attend events and get to know people. Yeah, get to know people in the practice. I think that's the best way. And
Yeah.
I know you are very open to mentor people. I have also done a lot of mentoring through the University of
Yes.
Queensland. And, I think as social practitioners, that's something that it characterizes us as well, of,
Yes.
being willing and open to support other people in the practice. So yeah, I think for the young people who is currently studying or finishing, is reach out to the practitioners in your network and
Definitely.
yeah, build those relationships.
Yeah. And do you think that that's a big enough one? You don't need a second one. Let's just leave it at reach
Yeah,
out.
just leave it at one.
But I think you're right. Like the one thing I found with this community and social impact is it's such a lovely, giving, supportive community of you've
Hmm.
just got to get yourself networked into it.
Yeah,
And if you're feeling a bit nervous, that's fine. We were all there early in our career where it felt a little bit overwhelming, and that's normal. Accept that that's normal, but know that on the other end of it, there's a lot of really wonderful people who are more than happy to give advice and give support.
absolutely.
So, like
Absolutely.
Carla said, everyone, reach out. So thank you very much for your time. I know you've got a busy day, so I
Mhm.
really appreciate you taking the time, Carla. I know you're absolutely flat out busy and very generous with your time today. So thank you very much.
I appreciate it. It has been a pleasure, Andrea. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great day, Carla.
You
Bye.
too. Bye bye.
Thank you for watching, and if you're listening, thank you for listening. Remember to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe. When you subscribe to the channel, I get more interesting guests, and we can all learn, grow, and share our stories together. Thank you for listening. Remember, hit the like button, share, subscribe.